एक और सर ने पूछा। तो अरे अवेकेंड हो आप लोग, पहले पूछना है क्वेश्चन, क्यों, किस लिए। So we have our very special chief guests here. So I will call them first to light our traditional diya. So we'll start with Advocate Dipali Oja, ma'am. Please come up. Krisha Shah, please come up. Dr. Aseem, please come up. Mr. Anmol Ambani, please come up. Side. गैस किसको बुलाना बाकी है? एडवोकेट नीलेश ओझा, प्लीज कम अप सर. So we have many, please be seated. We have many esteemed invitees here. So I'll just introduce one by one to you all. He is our good friend, Anmol Ambani. Advocate Nilesh Oja. Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Ms. Krisha Shah. And Advocate Dipali Oja. So sir, I will just request you to take your seats, please. सी अवेकन इंडिया मूवमेंट का तो कुछ बोलने का जरूरत नहीं, यहाँ सबको पता है, और अगर नहीं पता है तो आपके बाजू वाले से पूछ लीजिए. यहाँ पर आज हम सब मिले हैं एक बहुत अच्छा मेडिको लीगल टॉक के लिए. तो जैसा फ्लो हमने बताया है बाहर, क्या वी विल हैव ए गुड डॉक्टर असीम showing his slides and maybe answering few questions if needed, and then followed by our advocates Dipali ma'am and Nilesh sir. In between, myself and Johan will do our tidbits, and we will end it with your favorite grassroots warrior Nisha ma'am. So I'll just start with a video which has been made by Yusuf Bhai. Sorry to say his brother died yesterday, so he's not here. But let us start with that.
Be better off if we didn't even have a vaccine at all. We would have had it.
Lights बंद कर दीजिए please.
ये जो केसेस को अभी बढ़ाया जा रहा है, लोगों को डराया जा रहा है, ये इंटेंशनली ये सरकार जो है इस केसेस बढ़ा रही है और ये केस फेक पीसीआर टेस्ट के बेसिस पे बढ़ रहे हैं. काम हो अच्छे हमारे और नीयत साफ हो. काम हो अच्छे हमारे और नीयत साफ हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. अच्छे हमारे और नीयत साफ हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. दूसरों के दर्द में जो ढूंढे अपने दर्द को, रब भी देता है दुआएं ऐसे उस हमदर्द को. दूसरों के दर्द में जो ढूंढे अपने दर्द को, रब भी देता है दुआएं ऐसे उस हमदर्द को. बांट ले सुख दुख को जिसके दिल में ऐसी प्यास हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो.
There is no science, there is no logic, there is no common sense for mass COVID vaccination. Stop the shots.
Stop the shot. Stop the shot.
तो कीजिए ये वैक्सीन दिलवाने का पागल बंद कीजिए.
बस हो गया. Stop the shot.
Stop the shots.
जिंदगी में गलतियाँ होती ही आई है सभी से. काम जो करता है गलती होती भी तो है उसी से. जिंदगी में गलतियाँ होती ही आई है सभी से. काम जो करता अपनी गलती जो सुधारे दूसरों की माफ हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो. है वही इंसान जहाँ इंसानियत का वास हो.
I think what was most criminal is telling people who have natural immunity
तो इस बारे में इस विषय पे इंडियन बार एसोसिएशन की तरफ से एडवोकेट दीपाली ओझा ने उनको नोटिस जारी किया है और उनके खिलाफ प्रोसिक्यूशन का भी अभी हम लोग डिमांड कर रहे हैं.
एक तो आधा पुनावाला का बॉम्बे हाई कोर्ट का हमदर्द का ऑर्डर लिखे. तो ये दोनों हमदर्द है हमारे हाल में. यहाँ से हम बिलीफ को लेके हदफ चल जाएंगे सीरम इंस्टीट्यूट में.
आधा पुनावाला को
प्यार देकर प्यार पाना कर्म है इंसान का. मानव है तो मानवता ही धर्म है इंसान का. प्यार देकर प्यार पाना कर्म है इंसान का. मानव है तो मानवता ही धर्म है
these vaccines have had a hugely negative impact on society, on health.
Justice anywhere is back to justice everywhere. आगे के आने वाला कल बारी आपके अभी से एक साथ सब लोग एक साथ आकर इसका विरोध करें. चलिए.
Any that if ever there was a time for humanity to wake up, now is the time.
A standing ovation, guys, for all those people. Dr. Aseem, we are all over India, Awaken India movement. And this is what we have been doing. We have been going to churches, mosques, public schools, everywhere, teaching people about the vaccination. And somewhere with our effort, 20% of Indians are unvaccinated. That's huge. And with the police record, 30% of vaccinated people have false C. And we did a good campaign for boosters, because before booster, we got our mandates off, thanks to Nilesh sir here and Prashant sir in the Supreme Court. So the government data shows 30% booster. तो मेरा कजिन आया था, वो लीगल में है बिहार का पोस्ट ऑफिस में. तो किसी ने वैक्सीन नहीं लिया, लेकिन सबको बूस्टर का सर्टिफिकेट आ गया. तो गवर्नमेंट सब एम्प्लॉयज को ऐसे ही सर्टिफिकेट दे रही है, वो 30% बताने के लिए. तो गवर्नमेंट के हिसाब से 70% लोगों ने बूस्टर नहीं लिया, बाकी 30% में तो शायद ही किसी ने लिया होगा. तो ये हमारा बहुत बड़ा विक्ट्री है अबाउट कोविड वैक्सीन. तो अभी हमको आगे क्या करना है, किस हिसाब से करना है, अवेकन इंडिया मूवमेंट को क्या करना है, तो वी विल कम आफ्टर वन आफ्टर अदर. So now I will like to invite, first of all, Dr. Aseem. You can please go and, please, sir. Sorry, you have to operate that. लाइट सब ऑफ कर दीजिए प्लीज अगेन. I can do the full screen also. मोबाइल के लिए बोला.
Great, thank you. Thank you. It's part 3 of my trip in India so far. What an amazing atmosphere here, though, today, to be honest. I think this is already, I know this is the best crowd so far. We've had some amazing crowds. So over the next 40 or 45 minutes or so, the title of my talk today is Curing the Pandemic of Misinformation on COVID Vaccines Through Real Evidence-Based Medicine. Can you see it from the back? You can see? Yeah? So the first question really we have to ask ourselves, and somebody like me who's a cardiologist, who is an advocate of evidence-based medicine, who's well published, who doesn't have any commercial influence with my with my research. Why, when the evidence is so clear, it's not even debatable that these vaccines should be stopped and probably shouldn't have been rolled out in the first place. And I'll go through the evidence with you shortly on that. Why is this not being disseminated through to the masses, right? You are an awakened crowd. It's exactly the right way to describe awakened Indian movement. You are awakened, you're enlightened, you are closer to the truth than the majority of people in the world right now when it comes to the vaccines, right? So the question is why? And the barrier to the dissemination of the truth to the masses is not so much an intellectual one, it's a psychological one. That's the key barrier, right? And I'll explain there are 3 psychological barriers we need to overcome if we are going to ultimately win this information warfare against these big, powerful corporations. And the first psychological barrier is something called willful blindness. So this is something that we're all capable of in different circumstances, even in our own family environments, even, for example, a spouse turning a blind eye to the affair that they're having, right? This is something that's inbuilt within human beings. And it's defined as when human beings, when people turn a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and protect prestige and reputations. So that's the first barrier. The second barrier we're dealing with is one of fear, which was created by the pandemic. And when people are under a state of fear, it inhibits our ability to engage in critical thinking. And that's really important right now for people to engage in critical thinking. And the third barrier is very much a human-like state where, you know, people changing one's mind is one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can go through. And in academia, there's a great quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, a Canadian-American economist, is that faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no reason to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof, right? So we have to understand what these barriers are and acknowledge them, and then we have to then communicate with people who are not enlightened like we are in a compassionate way, right? I think that is really the way that we can win this. So what's worse than ignorance? The late great Stephen Hawking, which actually is really just an evolution of thoughts of Buddhism, of the Buddha, right? What's worse than ignorance? The illusion of knowledge. Let's start by defining what we ultimately is most important to us. Okay? When you look at international surveys, OECD international surveys, the single most important thing that is the factor that is important to human beings actually is their health, right? And then it's followed by a happy family environment. So the health is the most important for people. And the World Health Organization, who, you know, understandably are not in the good books of many people right now, they actually have a very good definition for health, and it's this. It's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. You can't have optimal physical health without having optimal mental health. You can't have optimal mental health without having optimal physical health. So I published this article in the Journal of Insulin Resistance in the end of, towards the end of last year, and I spent a long time writing it. And I wanted to really break down the data on the issues pertaining the Pfizer COVID mRNA vaccines initially, but also how we got it wrong, why we got it wrong, and what the solutions are moving forward. I didn't just identify the problem, I went into the root cause, right? And without understanding the root cause of any situation, any issue, without understanding the root of the problem, any solutions you offer are going to be flawed. So we have to go to the root of the root, the causes of the causes, which I'm going to take you through in the next half an hour or so. So let's start with something which I love, which is a very elegant, simple framework for teaching and practicing medicine. It's called the evidence-based medicine triad. And what we aim to do as doctors is improve our patient outcomes. What does that mean? Managing risks, treating illness, or, very important in a lot of what we do in medicine, is relieving suffering or improving quality of life. And we do using our clinical expertise, our experience, the best available evidence from research, and taking into consideration patient preferences and values. But if the best available evidence is corrupted by commercial influence, which unfortunately it has been, then doctors are making decisions for patients on biased information, and then at best we're going to get suboptimal outcomes, and at worst we're going to do harm. And unfortunately, the state of affairs even prior to the COVID pandemic suggested that evidence-based medicine has become an illusion, and it's become hijacked by very powerful commercial entities. And what happens as a result of that is that we create an epidemic, or in fact, I would say a pandemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients based upon a number of factors, which are biased funding of research. Research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not because it's beneficial to patients. Biased reporting in medical journals. Biased patient pamphlets, biased reporting in the media. That's a big, big factor from health misinformation. Commercial conflicts of interest, of course, defensive medicine, and last but not least, medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and then communicate health statistics. Without understanding the numbers involved, doctors, patients, and the public are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and fears by commercial and political interests. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic. Even the risk of COVID, I know in the lovely video that was shown earlier, there was a discussion about whether this was really a pandemic, what was the mortality rate. And I think that there is a point to be made there. Because one survey in America early on in the pandemic, of 50% of Americans thought their risk of being hospitalized with COVID, if they contracted it, was 50%. They thought there was a 1 in 2 chance they were going to be hospitalized, when the actual figure was close to 1 in 1,000. Right? So think about how that level of misinformation creates so much fear that then drives everything else that we do, whether it's compulsion of mask wearing, which we now know essentially has been a complete waste of time. Masks haven't been shown to show any significant impact. All of this was from understanding the numbers is really crucial here, and it's not complicated. I'm going to show you why it's not complicated as well. John Ioannidis is the guy that I describe as a Stephen Hawking-like figure in medicine, professor of medicine and statistics in the University of Stanford. And he wrote this wonderful paper a few years ago, which is called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And he says most doctors are not aware of the poor quality research that drives overuse of medications, underuse of maybe cheaper, safer options, lifestyle changes, waste in the healthcare system, avoidable harm, adverse events, and missed opportunities for treating the right patient at the right time with the right drugs, right? And most doctors are unaware of this. And of course, in America, many people in India, of course, there are different issues, different priorities in India, of course, in population health in many ways. But if you think about America, which is the richest nation on earth, 30 to 50% of all healthcare expenditure in America brings no benefit to the patient. They spend almost $4 trillion on healthcare expenditure in the United States, and they have some of the worst health outcomes in all the developed countries, right? And we know why, and I'll explain it. So what Ioannidis says is much published research is not reliable, and therefore and not useful to decision makers, and offers no benefit to patients. Most healthcare professionals are not aware of the problem. Coming back to what I said earlier, the illusion of knowledge. Most doctors do not know this. Most doctors do not know this. And if the doctors don't know it, how do we expect the patients to know that? The doctors also lack necessary skills to evaluate how reliable the research studies are, and then they can't then communicate that information to patients and families who then lack that level of information that they need to make decisions about anything to do with their health. And I've learned as a cardiologist, practicing doctor for over 20 years, somebody who's also been involved in health policy, who's met politicians, who's worked on health advisory boards, and met some very eminent people. Ignorance of this problem, which I've described, and Ioannidis describes it as well, is actually, even at the very highest levels of academic and clinical leadership, it's very profound. And a couple of good examples of this I will give you. So when Rochelle Walensky, the former chair of the CDC in America, when all of the information on the vaccine started to emerge, it wasn't stopping transmission, it wasn't stopping infection, she gave an interview and she said her optimism from the vaccine came from CNN, okay? Came from a CNN news report, which ultimately, that CNN news report she referred to was a verbatim reproduction of Pfizer's own press release. The chairman of the BMA, who I know, Char Nagpal, and I had conversations with him, he also said to me when I spoke to him about the vaccine, after I'd critically analyzed the data, and he said to me, Aseem, no one appears, and he's obviously at a level where he's speaking to chief medical officer and people in health policy, he said, nobody seems to have critically appraised the evidence as well as you have, Aseem. Most of my colleagues are getting their information on the vaccine from the BBC, okay? So this is unfortunately the reality we face, but it also tells you the power of media, right? Which we'll come on to. And the other interesting thing Ioannidis says, he says the greater the, and so he's also a mathematician. I mean, he's a brilliant mind. You know, he's the most cited medical scientist in the world. And he wrote this paper in 2001 in PLOS One, which is entitled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And he says the greater the financial and other interests and prejudices in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Okay, so if you look, for example, at the Pfizer vaccine here, and I'll elaborate in more detail shortly. We have a vaccine that is probably one of the worst in terms of efficacy, all right, in terms of benefit, the worst in terms of side effects, which has ultimately become one of the most lucrative in the history of medicine, right? We're talking almost $100 billion that Pfizer have made from something that is just terrible. That really explains the system failure that we're facing. So let's just state some very clear, important facts that people need to understand. Doctors. So there's a long history, certainly in the last couple of decades, where most of the top 10 drug companies have been found guilty of committing fraud. So between 2009, 2014, total fines from fraud because of the pharmaceutical industry, misdemeanors, totaled about 13 to 14 billion US dollars for hiding data unharmed, illegal marketing of drugs, manipulation of results of data. And Peter Gosha, who's a co-founder of the prestigious independent Cochrane collaboration, in this BMJ article, he says that when they commit these, when they're found guilty to commit these frauds and these crimes, nothing changes in the system to prevent this happening again. Often what happens is the drug companies end up making more in profit from illegal marketing of drugs and fraud or whatever else, than significantly more in profit than what they end up paying in the fines. And he says, if crime pays, you commit more crime. And that's exactly what's happening. So he suggests, and I agree with him on this, he said it's time to introduce tougher sanctions as the number of crimes, not the detection rate, seems to be increasing. Right? He wrote this in 2014. He said fines need to be so large that companies risk going bankrupt. Top executives should be held personally accountable so that they would need to think of the risk of imprisonment when they consider performing or acquiescing in these crimes. Now, when I spoke yesterday in KDH Hospital, one of the doctors there made an important point, and I think we should address this. This is not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not saying all drugs are terrible, all medicine is terrible. Absolutely not. This is about the excesses and manipulations. And of course, one would say, yes, modern medicine has achieved a lot, right? It produces life-saving drugs. We have many things, antibiotics. But another myth I'm going to bust for you, and I remember giving this talk in the University of Stanford to medical students a few years ago, and they were quite shocked. They didn't know this. When you look in the Western world, an increase in life expectancy from 1850 to now, there's been about 40-year increase in life expectancy. Okay, average life expectancy in 1850, in say in the UK or the USA, was 40 years old, right? Now we're saying it's about 80. So the question is, how much role did modern medicine play, do you think, in that increase in life expectancy? How many years did it add? Now, when they did a survey, there was a study that was published for educated American adults, right? Almost everybody, the average increase in life expectancy, they thought 80% of those 40 years, 32 years, was because of modern medicine. That's what the public believed, educated public. You know what the real figure is? It's about 3.5 years. Modern medicine has achieved a lot, but let's put things in perspective here. Right? So what is really behind the increase in life expectancy? Public health interventions, safe drinking water, seatbelts in cars, smoke-free buildings, safer working environments. This is what has been behind it, right? So good health doesn't come out of a medicine bottle, right? That's what you need to understand. Now, what about the net effect? So, okay, well, the pharmaceutical industry often are producing some great drugs. Of course, we know that. We believe that to be true. But how good is their overall effect? So this is a an analysis done in France, and this has been repeated in other countries between 2002 2011, of almost 1,000 drugs that were approved by the regulator in France. More than half of them were found to be copies of old ones. So what happens is the drug companies, they basically change a few molecules here and there. They pretend to the regulators and the public it's a new drug. They change the name. It's exactly the same. They patent it. They make money. And this carries on creating waste in the system because ultimately the public and governments are paying for this, right? So it's waste. But then what they also found was there was 15.6% of those 1,000 drugs were found to be more harmful than beneficial after they were approved. And 8% were only of increased therapeutic value. In other words, only 8% of the drugs of 1,000 were thought to be better than pre-existing drugs. But double the amount were more harmful. So what does that mean? When you look at that data, it's very clear. The overall net effect of the pharmaceutical industry on society in the last few decades has been negative, negative, negative. This is not just in America, in France. We know that in the United States, very similar figures there. Marcia Angel, the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, she said, "It is no longer possible to trust much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, which is considered the highest impact medical journal in the world." Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, he said a few years ago in an online editorial, "Possibly half of the published literature may simply be untrue." And then, of course, research misconduct is a big problem. Richard Smith, former editor of the BMJ, he wrote as well, not so long ago in the BMJ, that he attended a meeting with lots of academics in British institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, whatever. And he asked the audience, how many of you are aware of research misconduct or fraud being committed in your own department, in your career? 1/3 of the people put their hands up, 1/3, right? He then said, how many of you reported this fraud? Everybody put their hand down. So there's a cultural problem here too, which we'll go into the roots of this cultural problem. And then one of the worst cases I've ever read about of fraud or research misconduct was actually committed by a Dutch researcher whose work on the use of beta blocker drugs, okay, in non-cardiac surgery influenced European Society cardiology guidelines. He produced scores of papers, and it was estimated, eventually it was found that he committed fraud. He completely fiddled the data. There was no benefit from beta blockers in this situation. And it was estimated because of this single individual's fraud, there may have been an excess of 800,000 deaths in Europe over a 10-year period. This is one person. Now, why was this not world news when it happened, right? Most people don't know about this, okay? But this is a fact. So as a cardiologist, as a clinical doctor who only cares about, doing best for my patients, I became aware probably over a period of 10 years since I qualified in 2001 that I was noticing and observing as a doctor in the National Health Service, more and more people coming in with chronic diseases, more and more people taking more medications. We weren't making people better. Population health seemed to be getting worse. In the UK, for example, our life expectancy has now stalled since 2010, and more people are living longer with chronic disease, right? So our health in these Western so-called developed countries is getting worse. It's regressing. It's not getting better. United States is now seeing a decline in life expectancy. So aware of all of this and my own investigations to get to the root causes, I realized also there was a big problem. Obviously, there was a massive problem with diet-related disease, which I'll talk about briefly shortly. But there was a big problem with over-medicated society, and one estimate suggested that the 3rd most common cause of death globally after heart disease and cancer now is prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you, because of side effects that are usually avoidable, right? So in my private advocacy work, I was invited to be a consultant to the Medical Royal Colleges when I was just becoming a consultant cardiologist myself. And the Medical Royal Colleges essentially represent every doctor in the UK, Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Surgeons, obstetrics, all of that, pediatrics. And I convinced those Royal College presidents that the medical profession needs to launch a campaign to wind back the harms of too much medicine in conjunction with the BMJ, a medical journal that had started a campaign like this in 2012. And I was lead author in this paper, and you can look it up. And some of the co-authors here include some of the most eminent doctors in the UK. And you know, a lot of, and it was really just to highlight, and this became a big news story, you know, it was at least one day's news to start with, it was all over the news. And one of the other problems as well, in a healthcare system, when a lot of doctors are doing things that aren't beneficial, and they don't even know it, then it creates a lot of waste, right? And then, you know, it diverts from the patients that need it. So one doctor's waste becomes another patient's delay. So let's talk about misleading health statistics, because I said, I think one of the most important educational aspects, if you like, I think, from this talk, and anything we do in medicine, comes down to understanding the numbers in a way, you know, that, well, explaining the numbers as a doctor in the way that most people can understand. And this is not rocket science, okay? So let's look at misleading health statistics. This is very relevant to the vaccine as well. So there are many ways of presenting a benefit. We use something called relative risk or absolute risk. If you use relative risk, then it can mislead doctors and lay people to exaggerate the benefits of a treatment, as opposed to using what should be more honest, which is the absolute risk reduction. So I'll give you an example. If you look at the use of cholesterol-lowering statin drugs in people who have type 2 diabetes, the relative risk reduction from the trials is 48% in terms of preventing a stroke. Now that sounds quite impressive. If a patient comes to me in the consultation room who's got type 2 diabetes, I can say, and this is often what happens when cardiologists are doing this, if you take this pill for the next 4 years religiously, you're 48% less likely to have a stroke. Okay? You're 48% less likely to have a stroke. Now that sounds very impressive, but that's using relative risk. What does it actually mean in individual terms? Well, if you look at the trial on which that information comes from, the randomized control trial, it essentially means that you're reducing the risk of having a stroke from 28 in 1,000. So this is people who took the dummy pill and were followed up over 4 years. Out of 1,000 people in the dummy pill, 28 people had a stroke. And then you follow up a similar group of people, 1,000 people over 4 years, who are matched with with the control group, and you give them the statin pill. And only 15 of those had a stroke out of 1,000. Yeah? So what you've done is you've prevented 13 people having a stroke out of 1,000 people that have been treated. Yeah? 13 over 28 times 100 is 48%, right? Relative risk reduction. But the absolute risk reduction, the real risk reduction for that individual is 1.3%. Yeah? 1.3%. Another way of saying that is 1.3% is 1 in 77. Okay? So what we should be telling patients in absolute terms, and it's something I do very consistently now when the information is available, I say to the patient, if you take this pill religiously every day for the next 4 years, there's a 1 in 77 chance it will prevent you having a stroke. Now that doesn't sound very impressive for a lot of people, does it? In fact, but this is what we should be telling patients. That's what the clinical trial data tells us. And by the way, that's if we believe that trial data to be true. This is still likely an exaggeration. And this is part of what we call ethical medical practice, shared decision making. This is also part of what we should be telling patients. We call